Good morning. If we can take our seats. Everybody got a coffee? Okay, we'll start. Good morning everyone and welcome to today's seminar, What Works? Improving Labour Market Outcomes and Early Childhood Development for Indigenous Australians. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this building stands and the land that we meet on today, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jackie Arquette. I'm the Director of the Aboriginal Health Division in the Women's and Children's Health Network. I'm joined today by Stephen Gudlabardi Goldsmith and the presenters for today's seminar, Dr Tom Karmel, Dr Josie Misko, Professor Jennifer Bowes, Dr Rebecca Grace and Dr Sarah Wise. We also have all these doctors. We also have Dr Fadwa Al-Yaman, who is the Senior Executive from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare and also manages the clearinghouse. Just to let you know that the seminar will be webcast and recorded, so if you choose to identify yourself when asking a question, this will be on the webcast and it will be recorded. I'm not going to say too much about myself because I don't think there's a whole lot to really say about myself, so we'll get straight into it. Closing the Gap Clearinghouse is an online source of research and information on what works to close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage. It focuses on what works rather than outlining the nature or extent of the problems which we all know about. Today's seminar is another valuable step toward linking research and policy by making the research available and accessible to all interested Australians, but is of particular value to policymakers, program managers and service providers. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to Gudlabardi. Thank you.
I tell you, Jackie. No money? No money? Beautiful. I'm waiting for a response here in the language here. We're hoping that, I think when we talk about closing the gap, it's about meeting halfway. And I always encourage people, no matter where they live, to learn some of the local language, especially if you're working with the local Aboriginal people. Even if it's not their language, it goes a long way in creating a bridge that'll make a lot better relationship. Now, money is, are you good? And as you heard here, the correct response is money. Yes, I am good. No money? Beautiful. It's a great step forward. Ngai Gudlabardi waracha, ngai gani mina. Mani na budni karawirpari, mani na budni tananyanga, mani na budni gani mini yarta. Did you get all that? There'll be questions before you leave. I said, my name is Gudlabardi, as Jackie announced before. I am Waracha. I'm second born of my family. I have an older sister who always bosses me around. And that's my, I say, Yaicha Nari, my Aboriginal name, my Ghana Nari. My Pindi Nari, my white fella's name, is Stephen with a PH. And I always know when I'm in trouble. When I was a kid, they call me Stefan. Get here. And of course, I have a good, strong Hebrew surname, Goldsmith. Welcome to this place here. We sit here on a very beautiful place. And a lot of people say, how come every time we find a nice place it seems to be a special site for Aboriginal people? Well, I just want to let you know that we know about beautiful places and special places as well. You sit across here, Garawirapari, the Red Gum River here, and there's a campsite that existed not far across the river there, Pinky's Flat, and Piltawarli down the road, where our people settled along here many years ago before we were moved on. We sit on a sacred site not far from here. Today we call this place Adelaide. But for thousands of years prior to us calling this place Adelaide, we know this place as Tananyanga or Tanaganyanga. the rock of the big red kangaroo, a very special place, a very sacred place. We have a word here in our language which is sort of pretty big. One of our biggest words is ban 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 banaya, and it's a very ancient word, and it talks about gatherings. So it's appropriate you sit here in this part of the world, because on Ghana land in this space here was a traditional place where Aboriginal people from all over this region here would come here to sit, to do polity, to do ceremonies, to share stories, to talk about the issues of the regions, to come up with solutions. So this place was built for these sort of things, for people like you to come together to look at these issues that you will be talking about today, especially when we talk about closing the gap, and we hope the gap closes sooner rather than later. And early childhood health, I think, or a healthier early childhood, of course, will lead to better outcomes in adult life if we have a great education. And we have more important than a great education is the opportunity to get out there and become productive members of our community, as well as productive members of the wider community as well. So we sit on a sacred place. There's a bit of irony here for those who are not from Adelaide. I want to share with you, because when you talk about closing the gap, we talk about issues that are hundreds of years old that still haven't been resolved today. It's called an unfinished business. We talk about reconciliation, but Ghana people here, we still own this much land. And we still feel the pain of dispossession, of being taken away from our family, being taken away from our lands, taking our language away from us. We're recovering, but it all takes time. There's a generational thing that will take time, just as closing the gap, I think, will do as well. It's not something we're going to change overnight, but it's something we have to chip away at and have drive and longevity in it. We have to hang in there for the long haul. It's not something that's going to change overnight. This place here where we sit, we had the rock there. Tananyanga there's a bit of irony here. Was a sacred place for us, a spiritual place, a place where we'd go and learn about law. Unfortunately, one of the first acts of settlement in this area, after Colonel Light was led here by a man called Maliwadaburka, was the destruction of that site. And the irony is part of that stone went into creating Parliament House, something which has governed our lives for the last 175 years. And the other piece of that rock went to a little church just across the road here. So they destroyed our spirituality to create a spiritual place, destroyed our law place to create a place of creating laws that have dominated our lives for the last 175 years. So there are lots of underlying issues that Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal people are dealing with at the moment, and part of us is our own identity and return to our place in this country as Aboriginal people, as the oldest living, surviving culture in the world. And I always say, wouldn't it be a shame if this generation or the next generation was responsible for the destruction of this culture, rather than being proud and taking ownership and be a part of that culture as well, the spirit of this great country we now call Australia. I'm going to give you a few blasts on this. I think I've said enough. Some people say I suffer from verbal diarrhoea. This young man over there knows that. And I tend to, if I get a microphone in my hand, we'll look out. But I think I've given you just an overview of my feelings about some of the issues that we're dealing with, not just on the face, but also underneath as well. So some families are coping, some are not coping. All depends with their history over the last couple of generations. I want to share with you the sound of this instrument here. I guess it's become a symbol of this great nation of ours. We have the Boomerang, which you've seen the man on the front of the $50 note, David Yanaipan. He's a Ngarrindjeri man from this part of the world. He comes from my father's country down on the Coorong there. And he was on there because he helped to launch Leonardo da Vinci's machine. They put a boomerang blade on top of the helicopter instead of the yonga. So I guess the boomerang is a great symbol of Australia, not only that other big food market chain. But this one here, no matter where we go in the world as Australians, and we do travel a lot, we hear the sounds of this instrument, and we think of one place and one place only, this country here, Australia. But we must also acknowledge that this instrument is not a traditional instrument of the Ghana, but comes from the top end, up in Arnhem Land. Down here we say nungas. Nungas, you've heard the word nungas? If you come from Victoria, you heard Curries. If you come from Queensland, it's Murrays. All those, this local names just means people. Nunga's here for people, but if you go to Port Augusta, nunga means hello. So just beware where you learn the language, because sometimes it's detrimental in other areas. The local fellas know what I'm talking about. But up there in Arnhem Land, they say yulungu. So I'd just like to say mainmakto yulungu in their language. So thank you very much to the people of Arnhem Land for sharing their traditional instrument with us, but also with the world. I like to play these instruments when I do gatherings and meetings, because it reminds us about where we are, about the culture of this land, about the people of this land. It's very appropriate, I guess, in the gatherings such as this, where we're looking at a healing process that counteracts all the damage that has been done to Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal people in the past, something we must all work together to achieve the best outcomes for all Australians. This one here, the sound of this country, the sound of the earth. On behalf of my family, welcome to the land of the Ghana. I wish you a very energetic, a very positive day here today, talking about the solutions that have been ailing this country for a long, long time. So good luck and welcome to everybody. Thank you. I'll tell you, Jack.
Thanks. Join me again in thanking Gadlabadi. Thanks. Okay. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the first presenters for this morning, Dr. Tom Karmel and Dr. Josie Misko. Tom is, or was, the Managing Director of the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. He is a current member of the Australian Government's National Skills Standard Council. His research interests and experiences are in the economics of education and training. He has worked for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. His research interests centre on the labour market and the economics of education. He is especially interested in performance indicators in higher education and vocational education. Dr. Josie Misko is a Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Vocational Education Research, with particular research interests in the implementation of vocational education and training reforms, including accelerated apprenticeships, entitlements and prison education. She is also interested in the implementation of quality systems and regulatory frameworks in Australia and overseas. Her recent work has been focused on the quality of assessments, labour mobility of foreign workers, workforce development, e-learning and high-performance work organisations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Karmel and Dr. Josie Misko.
Thank you very much. I'm always slightly daunted getting up in front of this sort of audience at this sort of time with my sort of material. It is statistical in nature because I think it's because that's what I'm interested in. I guess that's what I tend to work on. But it really provides, I think, the backdrop to really trying to understand what will be involved in closing the gap. What I'm particularly interested in, or the project that we did, was looking at the relationship between education and training and outcomes in the labour market. And we made use of census data to do this. The 2011 census data didn't come out that long ago. And I guess what we were really interested in were the relationships and how things have changed over the period 2006 to 2011. And I think you'll find once you start looking at this material that it really makes you think. Okay, well let's get into it, and I have my first page of numbers. What I've done here is focused on the employment rate. Now, I tend to look at employment rates rather than unemployment rates because it's the proportion of population who are actually working. They're the people who are contributing to the economy and obviously keeping themselves and so on. The unemployment rate is a little bit hard to understand because it really depends on how many people are looking for work. So the employment rate, I think, is what we should focus on. And what I've done in this slide is just to look for 2011, for males first, the relationship between employment rates and a person's education. Now, the great thing about the census is that we can get a lot of detail, and that's what we've done in the paper, and I've presented some of these results in this slide. So overall, you see that among males, the proportion of non-Indigenous population working is about 77%, 0.77. In the Indigenous population, it's 47, 0.47. So we're looking at a huge difference in the employment rates between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is, of course, the relationship with education. And what we see from these figures is this really strong relationship between the level of education that you have and the probability that you're going to have a job. So if we look at the non-Indigenous population first, you can see that people who've gone to university and got a degree, bachelor degree, postgraduate degree, almost 90% of males are working. And but if you look at the other end of the spectrum, for those who don't have post-school qualifications, and if you look at the second last row, those who don't have Year 12, so they're early school leavers, you're looking at 60%. So there's this very big difference. But if we look at the Indigenous population, you see that relationship is even stronger. That Indigenous males with a degree, 85, 86% of them are working, very high proportion. But you go down at those early school leavers with no post-school qualification, 39% are working. So that's a very small proportion. If we look at females, it's pretty much the same sort of relationship, except the proportion of people who are working is a little bit lower. Less women work many reasons than men. But we still see this very strong relationship. And if I focus on the second column, Indigenous women, we see over 80% of Indigenous women with a degree, with a postgraduate or bachelor's degree, are working, have a job. Diploma, a little bit lower, 70%. Certificate 3 and 4, year 12, 70%, so pretty respectable. And then it starts dropping away. The reason that I split the Certificate 3s and 4s by year 12 is that the Certificate 3 is a very broad qualification used in many occupations. And typically, for the better paid, I always have to be very careful what I say here because I always upset somebody, but for the better paid, more difficult Certificate 3s, you need year 12. So if you want to become an electrician, you need year 12. Whereas if you want to become a hairdresser, you don't need year 12. On the other hand, electricians get paid a hell of a lot more than hairdressers. So there is this pecking order within certificates. So you can see this very strong relationship between education and the overall employment rate. And so I guess the underlying thesis that we have is that if we can improve education, we're going to improve the employment outcomes. Okay, so what we did in the paper was some fairly technical work to actually show how important this relationship is. And so what we do is to do a decomposition of those differences. Now I'll take you through this fairly slowly because it is a little bit complicated. So these were the figures that I put up from the previous slides. The overall employment rate in 2011. So for non-Indigenous males, 0.77, non-Indigenous females, 0.66, and then Indigenous males, 0.47, and Indigenous females, 0.41. So what I want to do is to try to explain how much education contributes to this gap. So if I express that gap in percentage terms, the gap for males between the non-Indigenous employment rate and the Indigenous employment rate is 47%. So the non-Indigenous employment rate is 47% better and almost exactly the same percentage for females. And then what I do is that I split it up into these various aspects using a bit of algebra. But the two things that I want to focus on are this, what I call the education effect and the net difference. The education effect can be thought of as how much of that 47% can be explained by the lower education of Indigenous people. The net difference is if we control for the difference in the education, perhaps there's still a difference in the employment rate and employment rates, which could be due to things like where people live, could be due to discrimination, but it is within the education categories. And then to do this arithmetic, we also did it by age, because the age distributions of the two populations are different, and the qualification distributions are different, because educational qualifications are now a lot higher than they were 10, 20 years ago, so we have generations of people coming through. So there are different things going up the generations. And then I come up with this thing called residual, and that's to make the thing add up. So that doesn't really have a great interpretation. Okay, so when I put the numbers in, overall, if I just look at males first, you can see that the education effect is 40.9 percentage points. So that gap of 47% is almost all explained by the differences in education. So that's for males. For females, pretty much the same story. So you start getting the picture as to how important education is if we are to close the gap. If we can't close the education gap, there's almost no prospect of closing the employment gap. The net difference is of some substance. So even if the educational distribution of Indigenous people was the same as non-Indigenous, with current patterns, there would still be a gap, but it would be much smaller. And then there are some other things that aren't so important. The demographic, the age distributions make a bit of a difference, but not really. And then I come up with this residual. Now, to somebody doing this type of work, the residual is a bit of an embarrassment because you'd prefer it to be zero, because you'd like to say we can explain everything from the education and the net difference. But the residual is not zero in this case, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. Right, so that was for the whole population. If I look at a particularly important age group, 25 to 34-year-old people, so these are really, you use the word prime age, but it makes you sound like a butcher. But anyway, a very important age group. So these are people mostly finished their education, should be in the labour market, should be working. And here we see that for this particular age group, that the percentage differences overall pretty much the same, 45% for males, 53% for females. But the education effect is even more important for this particular age group, this important age group. So we see that, in fact, it explains almost everything. So, as I keep repeating, the educational qualifications are just absolutely key in closing the gap. Now, this residual made me think. What it really means is that the changes are so large that we can't just take education to be independent of other things that are going on. There's something more complicated going on. And I think what you can, if you look at the difference in employment rates at particular qualifications, you begin to understand what's going on. And so what I've done here is to look at the percentage difference between non-Indigenous and Indigenous employment rates by qualification. So this is that net difference figure. But when you look at these figures, you're struck immediately of the difference in those rates at high qualification levels and low qualification levels. I mean, it just hits you in the face. So for males, postgraduate degree, diploma, certificate 3-4 with year 12, pretty small differences. But for the lower qualifications, particularly no non-school qualification, no year 12, so that's basically an early school either, somebody might have year 9 or year 10, the difference in the employment rate is 45% for males and 56% for females. If we look at that difference for females, we actually, for people with a postgraduate degree or bachelor degree, you actually get a negative figure. That is, the employment rate of Indigenous women with degrees is higher than non-Indigenous women. So I guess what I'm saying here is that if we can close the gap, we get a double whammy effect. We get the benefit of the better employment rates for the better qualifications, but we also get the benefit of this narrowing of the difference at the higher qualifications. So there's well, I call it a double whammy, some sort of, it would be a virtuous circle if when we can improve employment rates, education rates. Okay, so that's fine. So we understand the basic relationship. Now the question is, well, what's happened to the education gap? Are we actually making improvements here? And I find these figures quite daunting, actually. If we look, so what I've got here is a table 2006, 2011, making use of the two censuses. And we've got the education level. This is by school, and for Indigenous, non-Indigenous. So what we see is essentially, for the Indigenous group, it looks pretty good news. So year 12 or equivalent, 20% 2006, almost 25%. Year 11 or equivalent, going up a little bit. And so we see some of the other numbers going down. So year 9, really early school leaving. Year 8, proportion of people with those qualifications, that's declining. So that's all good news. But the issue that we have as you can see on the right-hand side where I've got the same figures for the non-Indigenous population, is that the population is not staying still. Over this period of time, educational qualifications over the whole population have been growing very significantly. So therefore the question is the extent to which the improvements in the Indigenous population are actually closing the gap. This is a pretty important question. Again, good news, I've got too many figures here, so I'll jump over them. But if you look at Year 12, you look at retention rates, again, great improvements in Indigenous students, but also things don't stay the same elsewhere. We look at training participation rates, vet training participation rates. Interestingly enough, the proportion of Indigenous young people in training is higher than for the whole population. Partly that's a good thing in one way, in another way it's a bad thing because it reflects the poorer results of schools and therefore the need to catch up by going to the vet sector and also fewer people going to university. But nevertheless the numbers are going up, so that's very encouraging. If we look at Indigenous apprentices, those numbers are going up as a proportion of all commencements. Again, that's quite encouraging. If we look at higher education, we see the numbers of Indigenous students going up faster than the number of non-Indigenous students. Again, this is all very encouraging. Okay, so taking all those things together, I've got a table that looks at all qualifications, 15 to 64-year-old people, and we can see that on the whole, things are looking encouraging in terms of the educational qualifications of Indigenous people. So bachelor degree or above, 3.8% 2006 up to 4.6%. That's advanced diplomas, that's gone up too. Certificate 3s and 4s at the higher level, that's gone up. Certificate 3s and 4s at the lower level, that's gone up. Just Year 12 has gone up, and so the lower levels have all gone down. So that's all pretty good news. However, as I said, things are not remaining the same in the rest of the population. So in fact, when we look at the changes in the non-Indigenous population, they're actually larger than those that we've seen. So the proportion of people with a degree has gone up by 3.7 percentage points more, and so on. So putting all those things together, we can look at what's happened to the gap, the education gap between 2006 and 2011. So the gap for bachelor degree and above in 2006 was 14.9 percentage points. The gap's gone up in 2011 to 17.7 percentage points. Advanced diplomas and diplomas, the gap's gone up again. So as we can, so the story is actually quite complicated, but it does make you think. We've definitely been improving the educational levels of Indigenous people over the last 5 years in particular. But in fact, the rate of improvement is not fast enough because the educational qualifications of the rest of the population is growing even faster. So I guess the overall story here, I won't bother about those, I've got the gong. So I guess my argument is pretty straightforward. There's no doubt that employment is strongly related to education. No doubt at all. There's no doubt that if we can reduce the education gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, then so will the employment gap be reduced. There's no doubt that educational qualifications of Indigenous Australians have been improving, and that's hopeful, but in fact not fast enough to reduce the education gap. So overall, in fact, the employment gap over this period between 2006 and 2011 has in fact widened. And I'll hand over now to my colleague, who will tell you at the other end of the scheme about some of the programs that have been that are in this educational employment space.
Good morning. My purpose is to follow up Tom's discussion with a brief look at the very many programs that governments, federal government, state and territory governments and the private sector to look at some of the interventions that have been put in place to improve educational outcomes, employment outcomes, or both of them. I would also like to draw some emerging themes. So here I've just put up a list of a very small selection of the vast array of programs that are available. There are programs that are focused on improving literacy and numeracy in schools. There are programs where social workers and parents collaborate to improve attendance and enrolment rates, and there are early signs of some success there. Also, there are foundations that provide scholarships for Year 12 students to achieve the Queensland Certificate of Education, and so about 2,500 students for those programs have attained a scholarship, and almost half of those have already got their certificate. Okay, but what I'd like to do is to actually focus on the program that has been looking at improving literacy and numeracy for students in remote communities. Now, researchers asked jurisdictions in New South Wales, South Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland and Western Australia to identify some schools that were actually achieving some high performances in NAPLAN. That's the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy, and to identify those schools that had sustained those improved performances. The researchers identified some key and common characteristics of these schools. They visited these schools in remote settings, and they found that the strong leadership by principals was very important in setting a clear vision for the school, in setting a coherent plan to improve these literacy and numeracy performances. There were common teaching and assessment strategies that were focused basically on teachers having a very direct and focused approach to improving literacy and numeracy. They had ICT programs that were blended with these approaches to help improve performance. They had a homework program in place as well. There was actually a core belief in principals and teachers in the potential of Indigenous students to achieve, and these was combined with high expectations of the work that students would do. In addition, there were targeted interventions when students actually had issues with attendance or with health and well-being. But it wasn't all about what was happening in the classrooms. It was also what happened in interactions between school principals and the school community and families and the community outside. And this two-way dialogue was imbued with respect and trust. There was a recognition that each party brought some learnings that were important to education. Each had something to bring. So good instruction cannot happen with good teachers, and so these schools also had strategies in place to recruit and retain teachers, to implement mentorship and some coaching programs to help new teachers. Now this study is based only on a small sample of schools, but some of the principles that have been identified actually can be used to inform practice for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, because it's examples of good teaching practice, especially for students with low literacy and numeracy skills. There's a vast array of programs looking at improving outcomes for VET and higher education. Indigenous Australian Apprenticeships encourage employers and service providers to help prospective apprentices and trainees gain contracts of training. There are programs which help the students in mixed mode programs to attend residential schools. to assist trainers and students with student placements, to provide some assistance so students can attend field trips, to provide some assistance so teachers can actually visit their students in the community. And I think they call that reverse block release. Indigenous Youth Mobility Programs is another program which is aiming to improve the achievement of Certificate 3 and above qualifications. And here, students are encouraged to move away to get these qualifications, but there are arrangements that have been put in place to help them. And some feedback from some of these programs are that students want to feel welcome, they want to feel safe, and they want to feel connected to their communities. But in addition, these programs help to build a literacy and numeracy, financial literacy, independent living and other skills. And some of the issues that have been found with students in these programs is that they might suffer a bit from homesickness, and they've put in, some programs have put in arrangements for them to access telephones to be able to stay connected. A key program is, that looks at apprenticeship training, and there has actually been some quite robust evaluations, is the New South Wales program, the Way Ahead program, which is based on allocating a mentor to apprentices and trainees to help with any potential programs. Now, some early results showed that the apprentices and trainees who are in the Way Ahead program were actually cancelling out of their contracts of training at a higher rate. And so what happened is they did a survey with these apprentices and trainees who had cancelled out and with mentors, and they found that most frequently these cancellations were because of poor attendance, difficulty with literacy and numeracy, and which made it more difficult for them to do their off-the-job training, poor punctuality, poor work, productivity issues, lack of reliable transport. And we know that from other apprenticeship programs, having a car is so terribly important, and there were other issues about negative peer pressure. And so what happened then was that the evaluation recommended that mentors should be allocated even before the employment started. And in addition, there was, and you know, people just don't cancel out of apprenticeships and traineeships because of all these issues that I identified, but they may have not been really suited to those particular programs. And so there was recommendations for having screening for the suitability of these apprenticeships. If we come here to there's another program I want to talk about, the Indigenous Higher Education Units. Now, these Indigenous Higher Education Units help to provide assistance to Indigenous people in universities. And a review was conducted about the access and outcomes of higher education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And what the review found is that, you know, there was positive acceptance of the work that these higher education units, Indigenous higher education units, were doing, but there was just too much responsibility placed on them, because really they didn't really have all those resources or the discipline-specific arrangements for learning support. And so the panel said it wasn't actually fair to depend on them to provide all of that the support, and they suggested actually that it was the faculties who should be providing discipline-specific support, mentorship support, and providing information on the connections that that Indigenous students could make with professional associations. That's okay, I can do it. Okay, employment programs. There's a range of employment programs that have been established or implemented to try and help Indigenous Australians achieve educational employment outcomes. Well, when we look at the Australian Employment Covenant, which is now joined with Generation 1, and it was led by industry, and it was to get employers to commit to providing jobs. And in 2012, about 334 employers were committed and to providing jobs. And so, you know, how many jobs could they commit to? And there's a total of about 60,000 that they committed to. But in fact, in 2012, 12,000 jobs were filled, and 71% of the people who had gained those jobs were still in employment for 6 months later. There are good outcomes from the Working on Country program, which looks at employing rangers, Indigenous rangers in many environmental programs. And when we've looked at the median gross income for these rangers, it was higher than the gross income of all Indigenous Australians. And it compared very well with other environmental programs. The Job Services Australia program also helps to provide assistance to Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australian job seekers to move into the workforce. And when we look at feedback from Indigenous Australians, they say that they would stay with the provider who made them feel welcome, who treated them with respect and trust. So there's a job services guarantee has been implemented by Job Services Australia, and providers are actually encouraged to improve links with local communities and increase the cultural awareness of staff. And in fact, the guarantee requires providers to train staff in culturally appropriate ways. There's an access to mentoring support for Indigenous job seekers pilot. And what they're trying to do is to see if one-on-one intensive support will provide better outcomes. So the general observation of these programs are that personal connections are important, and employers with formal policies in place are much more likely to employ Indigenous Australians. But money also talks, and wage and assistance subsidies have actually worked. Now, what the evaluation of this program found that there were only about 40% of employers who actually knew about the program. But Indigenous job seekers were reluctant to say that they had a wage assistance card. There was a control group study which looked at those Indigenous workers who were on wage assistance, and they compared to non-recipients of wage assistance. And this was after 12 months that the wage assistance recipients had been in work, and they found that in fact 51% of those on wage assistance were still in employment compared to 40% of the control group. And so it's important to look at and to help job seekers to not be that reluctant to say, yes, I'm on a wage assistance, because that can give them a foot in the door and lead on to permanent employment. Once again, the theme of trust and respect. I'm nearly there. So valuing cultural attachment. Now, some people might think, oh, if people are too attached to their culture, then they're not focused on their education and training outcomes. A key theme from the studies that we've looked at is that cultural attachment doesn't actually impede educational outcomes. And the real issues relate to inadequate literacy and numeracy skills. Okay, we could be forgiven for thinking, when we look at the key themes emerging from this experience with these programs, that they could also apply to non-Indigenous Australians. However, when we've looked at a lot of the research studies that have looked at some of these issues, we have to keep in mind that Indigenous Australians face a range of barriers to economic participation over and above those experienced by non-Indigenous Australians. They have lower level of education, poorer health, more difficulties with language and literacy and numeracy, higher rates of incarceration, and higher levels of inadequate housing and accommodation, which can also have a great impact on good economic participation outcomes. They are less likely to have access to employment networks and more likely to suffer from racial discrimination and negative perceptions, and we articulate some of those findings in the paper. So I've provided some information on the many programs that have been implemented to help improve Indigenous employment outcomes, and some of them have shown positive results, and some are still in the early stages. And as we've seen, some of these arrangements are still not enough to get close to closing the gap at the population level. However, the situation might be, well, we really don't know what the situation would be without these programs. It could be even worse. Anyway, Tom, did you want to? This is your last one.
I think we've run out of time here, so I'd rather just take some questions at this stage, and everybody would like to make some comments.
Okay. The conclusion was very similar to the other summary.
Thank you, Tom and Josie. We do have a little bit of time. I omitted to say at the start when I introduced Tom and Josie that there would be some time for questions before morning tea. So we do have some time for questions, but can I just, for those of you who do have a question or a couple of questions, just raise your hand. Yeah, because we're supposed to have some. You stretching or you? Yes, we do have a roving mic. Just a reminder, if you want to identify yourself when you ask the question, because again, it will be webcast and recorded. But that's optional for you to do that. You can remain anonymous.
Hello, my name's Danielle. I'm from Department for Communities and Social Inclusion. My question is with respect to the statistics. Were you able to control for rurality? So there's a significant proportion of Indigenous people living in remote communities, and what some of and how the influence of that data, how they influence the data.
And that's a good question. I mean, the simple answer is, in the analysis that I have done, we didn't. So the controls were for age, gender and educational qualifications. That's what we were concentrating on. But the thing, I mean, there's no doubt that I think a lot of Indigenous people live in areas that are probably quite hard to get jobs in. There's no doubt about that. But when we look at the relationship with education, what we find is that those gaps are really small for people with good educational qualifications. And I think one of the things that education buys you is actually more mobility. And so, in a sense, if we could get educational qualifications in rural areas up to what they are, say, in the cities, one of the effects of that, of course, is that people will leave. So these things go together. They're not really independent. Oh, absolutely. All these things are important. I mean, all the statistics do is to provide you with a description of what's going on and where. They don't answer any questions about why or any of those types of things. But the thing that comes across to me from the statistical analysis is we've got the statistical analysis which basically says things have actually got worse over the 5 years rather than better. And yet we have this huge number of programs. And when you do the micro evaluations, many of them, they always have positive things to say about the programs. But clearly, there's a disconnect between those two things. So my take on it is that to make a real difference, the little micro programs might be good, but it's systemic things that are absolutely important. And to me, I mean, that's the obvious segue into the next section of the seminar, which is about early childhood. That if you can solve the issues of early childhood development and education, that then puts you in a position where you can start looking at solving the issues of schooling. I mean, and we focus on Year 12 completion, but of course there's Year 12 completion and Year 12 completion. So it's that quality of outcomes at years 9, 10, 11, 12. Once you've solved that, then a lot of the other things are going to look after themselves. So I guess what I'm saying is that, in my view, it's these systemic things that are critical, rather than having yet another program to focus on a particular issue.
Yeah, we have a question down the front.
Joy Copland, you didn't show us a population pyramid of the Indigenous, or either Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And I just wonder if you could comment on the, is the job going to get harder or easier in terms of the volume of young people coming through? My understanding is the population pyramid for both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous is still quite different. And is the number of educated Indigenous people sufficient to influence those greatly, the education levels of their children?
As you point out, the population pyramids are quite different. In our paper, we actually do have a very nice histogram that shows that. It seems to me the Indigenous population is a lot younger, so the cohorts coming through are much larger, and this strikes me as being a double-edged sword. That this is the opportunity to actually redress the gap, because if you can solve these issues for these younger cohorts, they will just flow through and things will look after themselves. On the other hand, if what's going on is making it really difficult for these younger cohorts, then the problem's even harder than what it would be. And certainly all the literature, when you're looking at education, the importance of family support and motivation and aspiration, these are the things that really drive good outcomes. And we see, and these things are very difficult to solve. Clearly there, as an example, there are suburbs in all the major cities where we've had generations of people with low educational achievement, low aspirations, low motivations. These are the most difficult things to solve.
Any other questions?
I just wondered if in your paper you've got a definition of what qualifies as employment. If education leads to 4 hours of casual work at local checkout, is that included in your figures, or are you talking about full-time employment?
Well, in my recollection is that we've used the definition of employment that the ABS uses in the census. We're using census data. You're quite right, that covers all sorts of employment. But if you look at the relationship between education and employment, better educated people work more hours on average. They have better jobs. So if you take that into account, it just makes the story even starker. It basically just amplifies the importance of education.
Yep, down the front we have a question. Start thinking, because probably 1 or 2 questions after this, and then we'll break for morning tea.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Bowes from Macquarie University. I was wanting to ask about the programs in education and employment and the extent to which Indigenous people were involved as teachers and mentors and playing a role in those programs. Did you know from the reports?
Okay, well, in the working on the What Works, the work program, which looked at improving educational outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in remote settings, those schools that were identified actually also had some plans to make great use of teachers who were Indigenous. And so their principle was to use those types of teachers in those areas. And also, if you look at the Job Services Australia, which is about employment, yes, but they were also very interested in having staff, Indigenous staff, on at the site when, at the employment provider site, when Indigenous job seekers came along, and also to use staff that were well respected in the community. So a lot of the programs have a focus on having Indigenous staff be involved, whether it's in teaching or whether it's in employment service providers. There's a wish to do that, yes.
Any more? No? I'm sure that Tom and Josie will be with us during morning tea break. Thank you. We will break for morning tea, and then when we come back, we're due back in the room at 11, and we do have 2 more presentations about early childhood. Thank you.